I'm welcoming Stefan Schurig back, General Secretary, of course, of the F20 Solutions Network of the Secretariat that is actually based here in Hamburg. So
that's right.
Yeah. You didn't actually have to come very far. Now, Stefan, this morning in our high-level session, we already concentrate on two facets that are sort of threatening humanity right now, COVID-19 and, of course, the climate crisis. But there are some more facets that we have to sort of bring into the calculation.
Yeah, that's right. I think when we were planning this forum, we already felt we really need to give justice to the fact that we have the COVID-19 crisis, and as a solution for the COVID-19 crisis, it becomes obvious that we actually have to make our societies more resilient, less vulnerable, more resilient. And if you take the resilience as a goal, as your point of departure, you come to that conclusion. We cannot solve, or we cannot make our societies more resilient only looking into the different sectors, but more into how the different sectors contribute to an increased resilience of the human species. And that brings you to the obvious conclusion that there are a number of interlinkages between the climate crises, the challenge to provide enough food for everyone in the future, to create an economy that works for the people, and to protect the biodiversity, just opposite from what we see nowadays in the pictures. So obvious, we put this together and said we need to have a nexus panel and really have to look into those interlinkages. And that's the subject of this panel.
Nexus, of course, meaning they are somehow connected.
That's
and
right.
If you turn one screw, it doesn't mean that the other one goes in the right direction, but it can actually be sort of counteracting. And let's just do a quick recap. We're counting on around about 10 billion people by the year 2050. Last statistics from the UN is that we're losing 1 million plant and animal species, and they are on the verge of extinction. So there are two aspects that are coming together that are not actually working very well. So before we go into the subject with our experts, we'd like to know from you, and for those of you who've already been with us, you already know Mentimeter. Nevertheless, we are going to do the same spiel as we do every time. As I said, use your smartphone, go on the link, use the QR code that will link you up to the Mentimeter page. And as you saw at the beginning, there's one reason why we don't get the results straight away. I made the mistake of still having my laptop on, and 30 seconds afterwards we still heard the piano music, and that's exactly the same thing is happening when we get your answers on the Mentimeter. Now, the big question at the beginning is to find out where you stand, ladies and gentlemen. The first question is, how familiar are you in the following areas? Climate, biodiversity, food. And those are the first questions. And of course, you can shift at the bottom of the picture whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or in fact 10. It's not actually astonishing with the people that we address here with the Climate Solutions Week probably know a bit more about climate, and biodiversity and food are sort of slightly behind. Right at the moment, though, not too many people are in the actual voting, and you know that we only get a decent picture if quite a number of you have voted on that. Maybe we go to the next question.
All right.
The question about work.
Yeah, the work, the question that we want to ask you is how is your work related to the different subjects of climate, biodiversity, and food? So, are you considering yourself being more sort of working on climate or the biodiversity and the food? And the reason why we're doing this, why you're typing, is of course not to further put an emphasis on the different sectors, but to showcase then in the following discussions the different interlinkages of those areas.
Okay, and let's have a quick look. Again, 6 people out of 100 is probably not sort of the best outcome, but we again see that, of course, being in this forum, quite a number of people are more related to climate, secondly food.
It's probably because we called it a Climate Solutions Week, so probably felt probably more appeal to that subject, but obviously.
10 people have now, yeah. And again, if you missed by any chance the QR code, you can actually see the number at the top. So if you just go to menti.com, then you can use the code 9895544, and then you're in and you can participate, because we do have a third question. And that again has something to do with what we are. Now it's shifted a tad. Food is getting bigger. 13 people have voted. Now 14, it's getting better and better. Now all these 14 and everybody else who hasn't voted yet, what does your organization do? Does your organization work in one of the nexus areas of biodiversity, climate and food? Yes or no? And I would hope that the outcome is a little bit bigger and better than the one before. It's nice when those buttons fly in and when they sort of shift the picture. Maybe this is symbolic also of the world community, like you get to a tipping point of good action when enough people are there.
Same, and I guess it also shows us sort of that people probably are a little bit less willing to really think in those sectors. So that's exactly one of the goals of this Nexus panel, where we really want to put on top the issue of resilience, really, as sort of the ultimate subject of our different efforts, and then sort of to really increase our cross-sectoral thinking in these approaches.
Stefan, thank you. And with that, I will just quickly tell everybody that's watching, what we have planned is we're going to have 2 keynotes, one after the next, and then we're going to start the panel discussion with 5 absolute experts. And we're going to start off with Professor Niklas Höhne. He's the founding partner of the NewClimate Institute. Therefore, you know already that we're now talking a tad more about the climate crisis aspects, and everybody knows that Wageningen is one of the lead universities, not just in the Netherlands, but all over Europe, on questions of sustainability. He's a professor there for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, and as many of our experts, also involved in the IPCC 4th, 5th and 6th assessment reports on climate policy and international cooperation. And before I use up your time, Niklas, maybe you take it away and share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the possibility to speak here. I am showing some slides and I see that you can see them as well. Great. Excellent. Yeah, so I will have 3 main messages here, and I think related to the questionnaire that you had before, or whether you're more a climate person or more diversity person. I am really also more a climate person. So I have the first of my 3 messages is that climate action is more urgent than ever. And you covered that, but I think it's important to just restate that again. We see with many impacts on climate, droughts, the fires all around the world, the droughts and the storms being more and more, that we really have to limit climate to safe levels. And I think there's more and more the consensus that is limiting climate change or temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. That is important not only for climate, but also for our resilient systems. That is important to be able still to adapt to it. That is important to keep the biodiversity and food security. So this goal of 1.5 degrees is really important, not only for climate, but for the full nexus that we are talking about here. And it's more urgent than ever because we know more about the impacts of climate change, and we have done too little in the last years. And now it's really getting late. And what we need to do, it's just important to look at this again. This is a slide from the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. You may have seen this before. And the main areas, what we need to do is we need to first reduce emissions in all sectors. So also in the food and agriculture area, significantly, drastically in the next decade. Halving CO2 emissions in the next 10 years is one way of terming this. Then we need to go to net zero CO2 emissions. So not emitting more than our sinks can take. And there again, the land is very important because one of the most important sinks or taking CO2 out of the atmosphere is the biosphere, so everything that's on land and oceans. And then not only that is enough, then we need to go into a phase of net negative CO2 emissions. And again, it's even more important that there the biosphere does its part of it. And since we are talking about food and biodiversity, their emissions also come from methane and nitrous oxide. And also there we need to halve methane emissions quite quickly. And also nitrous oxide emissions need to be reduced. So that's on global level. Now, thinking about food and agriculture, we need to be aware that a third of the global greenhouse gas emissions are actually from our food production system. And that is because food production is not only the agriculture, that is clear. There are some emissions in agricultural sector, but there's also other emissions that we need to count towards that. One is deforestation. So if we have more agricultural land, we will then often it's a forested area that is deforested to be used for agricultural land, and that causes a lot of emissions. And then after we have the agricultural products, we need some food processing and transport, and that again is quite large. So all in all, emissions or greenhouse gas emissions from food production are around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if we now see that we need to reduce them to zero, basically by 2050, or to a low level, CO2 to zero, and the others a bit lower, and then go to net negative, that also means drastic changes in our food production system. Now, how do we achieve that? That's my second message. We need an integrated planning approach. It's not enough just to look at climate only, or look at energy only, or look at biodiversity only, or look at food or water only. You need to do it in an integrated approach. Only then you can find the right solutions, select the right solutions, and not do good on one end and forget that it may be negative on another end. And I'm showing here the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 different goals. And I think the challenge is to do planning that is taking all of these 17 goals into account so that there are more synergies and less trade-offs. 17 goals is quite complex. What I've seen from the Forest and Land Use Coalition is basically to condense these 17 into 3 pillars that you need to think about when you do planning. And I like condensing it to more simpler terms, so that maybe some guidance for the integrated planning if you look at these 3 pillars. So first pillar is efficient and resilient agricultural systems. So you look at your agricultural system, food production, you optimize it, you increase your yields, you limit the emissions from the agricultural processes, you look at water use efficiency and reduce the nitrogen and phosphorus emissions and the use there. So looking at the agricultural system as a whole. Then the second pillar could be that you look at is conservation and restoration of biodiversity. So at the same time, you need to limit emissions from deforestation, and you need to protect a certain amount of terrestrial land so that we conserve biodiversity and keep that sink capacity that's taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, to keep that available. And then a third pillar is to look at the food security and healthy diets, because I think if we change our food system and our diets in a certain extent, we can do a lot to make all of this happening, what is happening. And what we've seen in my first message is that we need to change our systems drastically, otherwise it will be too late. So we need to do everything that is at our disposal to get there. And that brings me to my third message, and that is, let's look at measures that are available that have these multiple benefits. Yeah. So let's avoid things where you have trade-offs, you solve one problem, but you create another. Let's look at those measures that help you to have multiple benefits, so get you to solve several problems at the same time. This is a picture from the IPCC Land and Climate Change report from last year. And sorry about the lot of information. I'm trying to explain it for you. So on the left-hand side here, you see certain measures that we can take. And on the right-hand side, you see certain colors. Blue color, dark blue color means, yes, there is a positive impact on these different elements. So it's about mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But it's also about adaptation, desertification, land degradation, and food security. So if you just glance at this picture, you see a lot of dark blue. So there are a lot of activities, a lot of measures that we can take that are good for all of these different dimensions. There's a few red ones, and they relate to food security. So there are some measures where you increase mitigation, so where you have reduced greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time, that's a threat to food security. And one measure here is reduced grassland conversion to cropland. So if you have grassland and you take it away and you grow crops on it, well, that's good for food security because you can grow more crops. But on the other hand, you increase greenhouse gas emissions. So it's better not to convert that grassland into cropland, but then you may have difficulties with food security. On the greenhouse gas emission side, the big parts are agricultural practices and forests. So reduced deforestation, reduced forest degradation, and changes in agricultural practices. So less fertilizer use, improved food productivity, or agroforestry. There's more to do in soils and other ecosystems, but the big ones are agricultural practices and forests. And they can be done in a way that are good for all dimensions. But then there's another big one, and that is the food chain. And the food chain is on the demand and supply side. Demand would be reduce losses of food along the way and dietary changes. So for the countries that have a high consumption of meat, there a huge lever is to change the diet and move to less meat consumption, and move into a more different diet with less meat and more diverse intake. That is only applicable to those societies that have high meat intake. For those with very low meat intake, that's a complete different story. And then the last one is not going into detail. There's more activities that you can take. Risk management, that doesn't do much to greenhouse gas reductions, but it helps you with all of the other ones. So there are many measures available. Coming to the summary, that's my 3 points. We have to act more urgently than ever on climate, and that will have benefits for all other elements, biodiversity and food. So those benefits are there. We have to take an integrated planning approach, taking all of the elements together, and we know how to do it. There are measures there that have these multiple benefits. It's now our choice to make the right decisions to implement the right measures. Thank you.
Very much, and we hope that we can also see you. Yeah, there you are. Thank you very much, Niklas. I know that, Stefan, you have a question. Of course, I have a question. You go first.
Well, I said to you, my question would be probably a bit provocational.
Go on.
So you go first. But if you put me on the spot now, Niklas, it's great that you're with us. And I think you always do a fantastic job in highlighting the problem analysis, so the root causes for the challenges that we are faced with, and also really showcasing those solution pathways, which are really important. One question that struck me today and yesterday, someone said, and I really like this analogy of pathways. What kind of pathways do you suggest? There aren't any pathways unless you walk the talk. And I really like that because that is literally the case. So if you look on existing solutions that you may have heard of in implementing those elements that you just suggested, are there any parts that you have heard of that should be strengthened, further strengthened? Any policies, any programs, any frameworks, any individual measures from people or so that you would refer to as this is exactly the way that lies behind those pathways that we've just heard of?
I think great minds think alike. I just want to add, you just said in the last word, we know. Of course you know, Niklas, but who else? That there is a way.
Thanks for these great questions. Yeah, I'm always I'm in this on this topic because I think we can still do it. And when I say we know it, it's not only me, but I think we as a society do know it. We have quite a lot of information out there. I was mentioning here the IPCC report on land. It has a wealth of information, what the different pathways would be, what the different measures are, what the trade-offs are. For me, the main obstacle is doing it. I mean, you cannot hide behind saying we don't know what we need to do. We do know it. That's not the obstacle. There are other obstacles. Society needs to change. We need to take the right decisions. And that is usually a difficult thing, but we definitely know where we need to go. And as I said, IPCC would be one good source. Then the question is on pathways. Where do we need to go? And there I'm doing analysis. I do scenarios, models. We can do as many models and model runs as we like. They are always wrong, no? Because we can't predict the future. For me, a very important output is we need to do the things of which we think they're right now, and we definitely need to avoid the things that we do know right now are wrong. And by that trial and error, trying all that we can move in the right direction. So if you think about specific things that we really need to do on this whole nexus of biodiversity, food, and climate, I think the one major thing where you can do a lot is dietary changes. I know it's not popular amongst the developed countries, those that have high intake of meat, but I think if you reduce that, that is good for your personal health, it's good for the climate, it's good for biodiversity, and all of a sudden, if you have less meat demand, you have a whole set of different problems solved at the same time. So that is one, I think, that is straightforward. Another one that we have been talking about ages is reducing deforestation. We know we are dependent on rainforests. We are dependent on them being there for diversity, for regulating the climate as a carbon sink. And we have a lot of targets out there, but we have really difficulties to really achieving that goal of reduced deforestation. And well, reducing deforestation to zero would be a super important goal, which we have to do very quickly.
Niklas, may your knowledge spread as fast as possible, and may politicians take the right action to come together with these nexus aspects and really consider everything and not just the one pathway. And we are going to go to the next issue and the next keynote speaker. But Niklas, as you've just pointed out, we are changing our diets. quite necessarily, because probably in the first time in humans' existence, we have the situation where people are more ill by eating too much of the wrong stuff, i.e. being obese, getting diabetes, than those that go hungry. And that's a almost schizophrenic situation. Let's get on to the next point, and the news there is also not extremely good. Today is the day when the Global Diversity Outlook comes out from the UN, and some commentaries from Berlin have already, BUND for example, have already called it a catastrophic decline then in less than 50 years. Wildlife population fallen by 2/3. That's unheard of. And of course, we're not just talking about the nice elephants or, the nice big cats that are dying, but things that actually support us. More about this issue and much more scientifically by Dr. Charles Barber, Senior Biodiversity Advisor of the World Resources Institute.
Das ist nicht Charles Barber.
Somebody so who is it?
As far as I know, it's not Charles Barber.
Who is there?
I think it was me.
It's you.
Oh, there
yes,
you are. I'm
of
sorry.
Course.
No.
Of course. Having a co-moderator is both a pleasure and sometimes not so much. Okay, no, Charles, please take it away. How bad is the situation, and where are maybe the one or two positive aspects where we can still shift the situation?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or morning or evening as it may be. I'd like to thank the F20 first for the opportunity to speak during this important week of important dialogues on climate solutions and climate action. And also thank the F20, as well as the Campaign for Nature and the Sea Foundation, who've been supporting the World Resources Institute, my institute, in carrying out a study on biodiversity, climate change, and COVID-19 recovery, integrated nature-based solutions for planet and people. That report's going to be released in the next few weeks. It analyzes the contours of our global environmental challenges, and it tries to propose an integrated strategy for addressing those challenges that is rooted in nature-based solutions. And it makes some specific recommendations for action in the Climate Change Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and by the G20. So the climate change and biodiversity crises are really intertwined. The loss of biodiversity reduces the resilience of both the planet and people to climate change, and it narrows our response options. Too often, however, biodiversity and climate change are dealt with in relative isolation from each other. That's just not something we can still afford to be doing. I'll try to explain why. So 2020 was anticipated to be an environmental super year, as you know, and we are indeed at a critical moment. And while COVID-19 has postponed the summits on biodiversity and on climate change, it does not reduce the urgency of addressing our global environmental challenges. Indeed, the pandemic has really focused attention on the risks arising from the imbalances in our relationship with nature and on the fragility of the bonds of globalization. They say that in crises, we can also find opportunities. And our present economic crisis has given us a chance, if we're bold enough to take it, to build back in ways that at once restore prosperity, reduce risks of future pandemics, and address the crises of climate and biodiversity, which are, of course, linked to our challenges around food security. So the main findings of our report will not, I suspect, startle many of you. First, as the moderator just said, nature is indeed under assault. And we have the new Global Biodiversity Outlook to reaffirm that. Some 40% of the world's land has now been converted to agricultural or urban uses. Only 23% of land and just 13% of the ocean can still be classified as intact ecosystems. Forests, coastal, marine, grassland, and freshwater ecosystems have all been reduced and degraded, and the pressure continues to build. As we've seen in my own country, for instance, with the immense fires going on the West Coast. Second, conserving nature is critical for achieving the Sustainable Development Agenda. The previous speaker talked about the SDGs, and of course, the SDGs include goals on climate change and biodiversity. But these so-called environmental goals also underpin economic and social goals on alleviation of poverty, hunger, health, water, and food security. We can't do it in isolation. Third, slowing the loss of primary forests and coastal ecosystems in this context must be our most urgent priority in terms of conservation. All ecosystems are, of course, important, but our remaining primary forests and the biodiversity-rich and carbon-dense coastal ecosystems, including coral reefs and mangroves, are the most critical for slowing biodiversity loss and for both climate change adaptation and mitigation. These are also the ecosystems facing the fastest rates of degradation and loss. Quite simply, if we lose those battles, we lose the war. Fourth, COVID-19 has demonstrated the cost of the growing imbalance between people and nature. The zoonotic origin of the pandemic has highlighted the risks of disrupting the equilibrium between human and natural systems. The impacts on human health and the global economy have been devastating, straining public health and financial systems, and throwing social and economic inequalities into sharp relief. And the progressive destruction of nature, tropical forests in particular, appears to be a significant causal factor driving zoonotic disease outbreaks. So, what can we do in the face of such daunting challenges? We heard a bit about this from the climate side and the diet and food side of things from the previous speaker, and I completely agree with those points. In our work for this report, we've been doing, we believe a big part of our collective approach must lie in devising and adopting nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions can be defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystems that at once address societal challenges while providing for human well-being and helping achieve climate and biodiversity goals. Goods and services from nature or relying on nature are worth trillions, and nature-based solutions can deliver big economic benefits as well as preserving Earth's biological and atmospheric operating systems that we so depend on. Nature-based solutions come in many variations, but protection and strengthening of the ecological integrity of natural ecosystems must be their guiding principle. It's because the closer that ecosystems are kept to natural patterns of biodiversity distribution and abundance, the higher the stability and quality of the ecosystem services that they provide to us. So building on this core principle of ecological integrity, effective nature-based solutions need to be employed along three broad dimensions. First, as has already been mentioned, we must protect the most biologically diverse, carbon-dense natural ecosystems through legal designation and effective management of protected areas, including recognition of the rights and conservation efforts of indigenous peoples in their territories. Second, we must restore the ecological integrity and economic productivity of degraded lands and ecosystems by a broad range of landscape restoration measures. Third, finally, we must connect, or in some cases reconnect, natural ecosystems to each other across land and seascapes in ways that maximize complementarities across climate, biodiversity, and development interventions and goals. So we know that we have these two big summits next year, and we need to see ambition and momentum and a lot of progress if we're going to solve these crises. What can the G20 as a unique body do to move us in the right direction? And very briefly, three things I'd like to mention here. First, it would be great and important for the G20 to reaffirm the principle that the conservation of natural ecosystems is a key priority for achieving both climate change and biodiversity goals, as well as for reducing risks of future zoonotic pandemics. Second, the G20 should send a strong political message on the need for cooperation across the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention to promote and adopt nature-based solutions as an integrated strategy for both climate change and biodiversity loss. I don't think that message is going to come individually from the silos of those conventions. It needs political guidance from higher up. Third, the G20 must commit to a truly green and just economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic consequences. And it needs to stand against the tendencies that we have seen in some places to weaken environmental policies, reduce transparency, restrict political freedom, in the name of so-called pandemic response and recovery measures. Those are the approaches that got us into trouble in the first place. Our report contains detailed recommendations for action for COP26 on climate and COP15 on biodiversity next year, and for how the G20 can act to ensure successful outcomes on those issues and in those processes. I will have a chance to read the report and that you find it useful as we prepare for this critical coming year. I'd like to close by drawing your attention to an important decision of the climate COP25 last year, which noted, quote, the essential contribution of nature to addressing climate change and its impacts and the need to address biodiversity loss and climate change in an integrated manner. If we can turn that principle into actionable policy over the coming year, the prospects for both planet and people may just yet brighten for the generations to come. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, and you should wear a tie very more often. I didn't recognize you in the first place because I've never seen you with a tie. It fits you extremely well, I have to say.
I am in my basement. I am in my basement in the tie for the first time in many months, yes.
You should have warned me, man. Anyway, I think your points were very, very well made, and I think that's what we from the F20 platform try to do with this report that Charles just alluded to. We want to sort of highlight that there is not just an inclusive thinking in terms of the different challenges, but that there are very concrete mechanisms that need to be implemented and that have an impact on the different sectors, on biodiversity. And this concept of nature-based solutions can be, if you do it correctly, can be such a concept that really connects the challenge of protecting and restoring our natural resource and protecting the climate.
Thank you. And Charles, if you don't mind, my question is really, from what you've said, how important would it be to get those two tracks, like the Bio COP15 and the COP26 on climate? How important would it be to actually merge them? Because we're talking basically of two sides of the same coin.
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of merging them, but to have them operate in a complementary and synergistic manner is really, really important. What you see, I was in the last biodiversity, the open-ended working group on the post-2020 biodiversity framework in February, and there's a lot of people who are saying nature-based solutions to climate change is not our business. That's something that's over on the climate side because it's about climate change. And on the climate side, you have some rather perverse rules about how carbon is accounted for, which are making it very difficult to mobilize these kinds of solutions, whether they be conservation and restoration for climate. It's less of a problem on adaptation. I think people recognize the key importance of, in particular, coastal systems for adaptation to the impacts of climate change. But on the mitigation side, there's still really very much two silos, and we need to break that down. And this is why the G20, I think, can play a role. Climate negotiators tend to look with suspicion on the biodiversity side and vice versa. It's two long-standing processes. Only when their bosses tell them that they have to begin to work together and countries, a critical mass of countries talk to each other, can we begin to bridge that gap and come up with integrated solutions.